A banker drove to Ruth Beaumont's farm in 1987 to tell a woman with a master's degree in agricultural economics that she didn't understand business. She listened. She said nothing. Then the crisis hit. Farms across Cass County went to auction. One by one, the men who had laughed at her 30-year-old tractor lost everything they owned. And Ruth? She showed up at every auction with cash. The question isn't how she survived while everyone around her collapsed. The question is, why did everyone already know she would? The morning Dale Whitmore drove his Buick down Sycamore Creek Road. The dust rose behind him like something trying to catch up and warn him. It was July of 1987, a Tuesday, which in Cass County, Dematzpica, meant the feed co-op would be half empty, and the grain elevator would be posting numbers nobody wanted to look at, and the kind of men who ran banks would be making their rounds in vehicles too clean for the roads they traveled. Ruth Elaine Beaumont was already in the equipment shed when she heard the engine. She was 60 years old. She had the hands of a woman who had changed her own oil since age 19. The posture of someone who had long ago decided that slouching was a waste of structural integrity, and a master's degree in agricultural economics from the University of Nebraska that sat in the bedroom drawer because she had never found a wall worth hanging it on. She had earned it by correspondence over 4 years while managing 40 acres and raising 2 children after Harold died, not because she needed the credential. She already understood the material, had understood most of it before she enrolled, but because she believed that understanding something and being able to demonstrate that you understood it were 2 different tools, and a working woman on a Nebraska farm in the 1970s needed every tool she could carry. She was lying on flattened cardboard beneath her 1959 International Harvester Farmall 560, repacking the left rear wheel bearing when the expensive engine sound slowed at her cattle guard and crunched up the drive. Good tires on gravel, street tires, 1 door, hard-soled shoes on uneven terrain, the walk of someone whose professional life had been conducted entirely on pavement. "Hello, I'm looking for a Mrs. Beaumont." "Under the tractor," she said without moving. A pause. Expensive trouser cuffs appeared at the edge of her vision. The man crouched. His face appeared in the gap between the tractor's belly and the dirt floor. Young, clean-shaved, practiced smile over something that might have been surprise. "Mrs. Beaumont? I'm Dale Whitmore, First Agricultural Bank, Plattsmouth. We've been trying to reach you by telephone." "Phone's in the house," she said. "I'm in the shed." She finished the bearing, assembled the hub, wiped her hands, and stood. He was 31 or 32, she estimated. The Buick LeSabre in her driveway was a 1986, charcoal gray, recently washed. He had a leather briefcase, the kind that signals to certain rooms that the person carrying it belongs there. She had been in those rooms. She knew what they signaled, and she knew what they failed to account for. "There's a chair on the porch," she said. 10 minutes. She washed her hands at the shed's utility sink and walked up to the house. He was sitting in the wooden chair with his briefcase on his knees, looking at the farm with the expression of a man forming an opinion about something and finding it more complicated than expected. She brought 2 glasses of water, handed him one, and sat on the porch step. "Now," she said, "what is it you've driven out here to tell me?" He opened the briefcase with the fluency of someone who had given the same presentation in many farmhouse kitchens that summer. The Agricultural Modernization Initiative. A package loan, in her case, between $170,000 and $200,000. A John Deere 4250 65 horsepower over her current setup. A disc chisel, a 12-row precision planter, optional GPS guidance, 15-year term. 11.5%, she said, when he reached that part. That's the current Prime Plus 2 for agricultural. Monthly payment on $200,000 at 11.5 over 15 years. He had the figure ready. $2,231 per month. And my projected net income per year for this operation. Based on current commodity prices and your acreage, somewhere in the $18,000 to $22,000 range. $20,000 a year, she said. $1,660 a month. You're proposing a monthly payment of $2,200 against a monthly income of $1,600. The efficiency gains from the new equipment would. Mr. Whitmore. She set down her water glass. What's your educational background? He blinked. It was not the question he had been trained to handle. Business administration. Creighton University. I have a master's degree in agricultural economics from the University of Nebraska, she said. I've run this operation for 12 years. I understand compound interest, commodity futures, equipment depreciation schedules, and the specific mathematics of the loan you're proposing well enough to perform them in my head while lying under a tractor. She said this without heat, in the tone of someone stating coordinates. So when I tell you the payment structure doesn't work, I'm not telling you that because I don't understand the offer. I'm telling you because I understand it better than the glossy sheet does. Dale Whitmore sat very still for a moment. The farmall, she continued, cost my husband $900 in 1961 used. I've spent approximately $5,000 on it in parts and maintenance over 26 years. It is paid for. It works. I understand it completely. No software to lock me out, no satellite required, no dealer service call when something fails. I fix it myself because I know how. She picked up her water glass. I'm not interested in your loan. I appreciate you making the drive. He recrossed his legs. The practiced smile had not entirely recovered from the graduate degree. He said the thing he said, which was not the cruelest thing anyone had ever said to Ruth Beaumont, but was perhaps the most completely wrong, delivered with the confidence of a man who had never had reason to doubt his assessments. Mrs. Beaumont, he said, and his tone had shifted into something she recognized, the register certain men used with women who had declined to be educated by them, not quite condescending but adjacent to it, in a way that preserved deniability. I understand the attachment to familiar methods. I see it often with operators who've been on the same ground a long time. But I have to be honest. The operations that are surviving, the ones that will be competitive in 10 years, are the ones investing in modern capacity. Running 30-year-old iron in today's market, he paused. You're going to be left behind. This is a business. It has to be treated like one. Ruth looked at him. Not coldly. Simply the way you look at a gauge you are reading. I have been treating it like a business, she said, since before you were in high school. She stood. He left. She watched the LeSabre go back up Sycamore Creek Road, raising dust in the morning light, and then she walked to the shed and started the farmall, which turned over on the first chuff pull and settled into its chuff-chuff-chuff with the patient reliability of a thing that had no opinion about whether it was modern. She sat on the tractor a moment, engine idling. This is a business. It has to be treated like one. She had been treating it like a business since 1975, when Harold died on a Tuesday in April. She had always thought there was something symbolically wrong about a Tuesday, from a heart attack at 54 in the East Pasture. She had arranged the funeral, sat at the kitchen table for 2 days, and then gone back to work. There were 80 acres to tend and no one else to tend them. She had grown up 30 miles northwest on 120 acres outside Weeping Water that her grandfather had broken in 1901, and her father Everett had held through the 30s without losing. Everett Bauer was a serious man, not grim but serious, who kept his accounts in a ledger with the same care he gave to the soil, and who had watched two neighbors lose their farms in 1936, not from bad farming, but from debt. Payments that couldn't be met when corn dropped to 8 cents a bushel and stayed there. He had watched men he'd known since boyhood load their families into cars and leave, and the lesson he extracted from this was not sentimental but structural. The bank is not your partner. The bank is the entity that will own your land when times turn, if you have let yourself depend on it. He had sat Ruth at the kitchen table when she was 9 years old and taught her to keep accounts. Not as a lesson, but as a practice, the actual figures of the actual farm, explained with the patience of a man who understood that a child who knew the numbers knew the truth of the situation, and a child who knew the truth was a child who could make real decisions. He had done this with her every month until she left for university in 1949 on a scholarship she had won by being the best student in Cass County 3 years consecutively, a fact the county school board had received with something between pride and unease, because the scholarship's implicit expectation was for a certain kind of student, and Ruth Bauer at 22 was already not that. At the University of Nebraska, she was one of 4 women in an agricultural economics program of 61. She navigated this not with performance or aggression, but with competence, the thorough, unhurried competence that becomes its own argument over time. She had a professor in her second year who graded her papers with a rigor he did not apply to her male classmates. She discovered this by comparing her scores to theirs on questions she knew she had answered correctly, and she went to his office hours with her answers and the relevant literature, and asked, politely and precisely, for the grading criteria to be explained. He corrected the grades without apology. She passed and moved on, because there is a difference between a principle worth fighting and a grade in a course in 1951. And Ruth Bauer knew the difference. She met Harold Beaumont at a co-op meeting in her final year. Quiet, second-generation Cass County, a man who thought before speaking and was therefore worth listening to. They married in fall of 1953. He ran the machinery. She ran the books. Except that she also ran machinery, and he also ran books, and the farm ran because both of them understood both sides completely. This was unusual enough in Cass County to draw comment. At a county meeting in 1961, a man used the word uppity to her face, and she had looked at him with the same neutral attention she gave to everything and said nothing, because she had decided years earlier that the most effective response to being underestimated was to let the arithmetic respond, and the arithmetic was patient and never lost. When Harold died, the operation did not pause. It couldn't. The ground didn't care about grief. The cattle needed feeding. The equipment needed running. The figures needed to balance. She learned to do everything Harold had done, added it to everything she already did, and found, to no great surprise, that the farm ran on. She owed nothing. Had owed nothing since 1978, when she made the final payment on the grain storage bin she'd built in the difficult years after Harold's death. Since then, she had operated entirely on cash. Her expenses were low because her equipment was paid for, and because she maintained it herself, which required knowing it completely, which she did. The farmall, the 1963 IH planter rebuilt twice, the 1970 disc harrow, bought at auction for $380, the 1966 New Holland baler, whose temperament she managed the way you manage a difficult but fundamentally reliable colleague, by knowing its weaknesses and addressing them before they became failures. She kept maintenance logs, spiral notebooks, one per machine, in the cabinet by the shed sink. Every service, every repair, every replaced part, recorded with date and engine hours. She could tell you when the left rear wheel bearing on the farmall had last been repacked, when it would need repacking again, and what it would cost. No surprises. On a farm, surprise and expense were nearly synonymous. What Dale Whitmore's analysis could not accommodate, what the glossy sheet from the John Deere dealer could not show, was the cost of dependence. Not just the debt service, though the debt service was ruinous on its face. The cost of equipment you did not understand, could not diagnose, could not fix. The cost of waiting 3 days for a dealer service appointment while a field sat unplanted. The cost of a software update that locked a machine out of its own field. This had started happening, she had read, with the newer computerized systems. The cost of being helpless in the face of a mechanical problem that had a physical cause and a physical solution, if only you knew the machine well enough to find it. That cost did not appear on any spreadsheet she had ever seen from any bank. It was real nonetheless. She put the farm all in gear and went to work. The fall of 1987 was not catastrophic. Corn came in near projected yields. Prices at the elevator were lower than anyone wanted, which was the elevator's permanent condition. Ruth hauled her corn, collected her check, and netted $18,700 after all operating expenses. Below average. She adjusted, reduced corn acreage 20%, increased beans, deferred disc blade replacement, unless the current set showed failure. These decisions went into the ledger margins in her small, precise handwriting. Then she made coffee and went to bed. The winter of 1987 into 1988, she read the extensioned bulletins and listened at Mercer's Feed and Grain on Tuesdays and Fridays. Those conversations carrying the particular sound her father had described from the 30s, of people not quite ready to say what they saw coming. Land values that had risen to implausible heights during the inflationary 70s were in genuine retreat. The farm credit system was in serious difficulty. The commodity prices that were supposed to service a decade of agricultural debt were not doing so. She did her arithmetic. It was simple and the same as it had always been. No debt service. Every dollar earned went back into the operation or into the savings account at the Plattsmouth Credit Union, which by fall of 1988 held $41,000. The auctions began in spring of 1988. She drove to the first one on a Thursday morning in April. The Henderson place, 120 acres that Bill Henderson had farmed since 1960 and that his family had held for 2 generations before him. Bill had borrowed in 1979 and again in 1981, rolling the loans together each time with a banker's reassurance and the reasonable optimism of a man who had watched land values rise for 15 years and had no compelling reason to believe they would stop. Now the bank held a mortgage that exceeded the value of the land, and the income the land produced could not service the interest. She stood at the back of the crowd and watched. The John Deere 4440, Bill Henderson's machine, the one she had watched him drive every season since 1980, sold for $29,000. He had paid $81,000. The planter sold for $5,800. The farm itself sold to a holding company from Omaha for $194,000, which was $62,000 less than Bill Henderson owed. Bill stood at the far edge of the crowd in a corduroy jacket she recognized from 20 years of seeing him at the co-op. He did not leave. He watched the whole thing. His expression was not grief and not rage. It was something more total. The look of a man watching the removal of the structure that had given his life its shape, understanding in real time that the shape was gone, and the finding of a new one would be the work of whatever years remained. She drove home and sat at the kitchen table and opened the ledger. The figures were the same as they had always been. The bottom line was on the right side of zero. She thought about what her father had told her the year he watched his neighbor load a truck in 1936. There is a place between sorrow and clarity where you can act well and act honestly at the same time. The sorrow and the clarity don't cancel each other. You hold them both. She held them both. Then she drove to the county clerk's office in Plattsmouth. She bought her first parcel in June of 1988, 20 acres adjacent to her north fence line, part of the Tennyson estate being liquidated by children in Denver and Seattle who had no interest in farming Cass County ground. $1,110 an acre. Cash. She drove the parcel's boundaries that evening, reading the drainage patterns and soil color, and the way the ground held together when she squeezed it, which told her things no appraisal documented. The second parcel came in October, 25 acres from Darrell Pratt, who had seen the foreclosure coming and decided to liquidate a portion at a price of his choosing rather than wait for the bank to liquidate everything at the banks. He asked $950 an acre. She paid $950 without negotiating, because $950 was fair, and because she had a principle about fairness with people under pressure. You did not grind them. The person on the other side of the transaction would live in the same county as you for the rest of your life, and the money saved by grinding cost more in other currencies over time. Darrell Pratt shook her hand at closing. "I heard you turned the bank down last summer," he said. "I did," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the exhaustion of a man who had been fighting a bad financial situation for 3 years. "I wish I'd done that," he said. "Back when I still had options." She didn't know what to say that wasn't sentimental or cruel, and she had no appetite for either. "I hope the pressure eases," she said, and meant it. She farmed the new 45 acres that fall. The farmall managed it without difficulty. The planter managed it without difficulty. The figure at the bottom of the year's ledger column, in 1988, described in the agricultural press as the worst year since the 1950s, was larger than it had been in 1987. She went to Mercer's on a Friday morning in November and found Dale Whitmore at the counter. He was in jeans and flannel. Now, an approximate the local style that wasn't quite in the way when approximations never are when the person attempting them comes from somewhere paved. His boots were genuine but unmudded. He was talking with Gary Mercer and 2 farmers she knew, Phil Dunmore from the county's north end and Warren Beal, who ran grain operations east of town, about loan restructuring options. He saw her as she came through the door. Something moved across his face, recognition, then the recalibration she had seen before on the faces of certain men encountering her in professional contexts, the rapid negotiation with themselves about which tone was appropriate. He landed on professional warmth. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." Phil Dunmore, who found awkwardness tedious, said, "You two acquainted?" "The bank paid me a visit last summer," Ruth said. "With loan proposals? How's that program doing?" Warren Beal asked, and the flatness of it carried everything it needed to carry without being directly addressable. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man in the middle of revising several previously settled positions. "The commodity price environment has been challenging," he said. "We're working with borrowers on restructuring." "I drove past the Henderson place last week," Phil said, addressing no one in particular. "Binds are empty." The silence that followed had a specific texture. Everyone in the room understood it. Mrs. Beaumont. Whitmore turned to her, and this turn was different from the one on the porch in July, less assured, more genuinely inquisitive. "You're still running the same operation." "Still running it," she said. "I heard you've been buying land. When the price was right, at the auctions. And from Darrell Pratt directly. He turned this over. "You had the cash," he said. "I had the cash because I didn't have the debt service." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him doing arithmetic he hadn't done in July. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said it carefully. "Last summer, when you told me you had a graduate degree in agricultural economics, I didn't know what to do with that. I kept going with the presentation anyway." He paused. That was wrong. The room was very still. Gary Mercer found something to do with the inventory behind the counter. Phil Dunmore looked at his boots. "Yes," she said, "it was. I'd like to understand what I've been missing," he said, "operationally. If you're willing to walk me through it sometime." She looked at him. He was not performing this. She could tell the difference. "Come by on a Saturday," she said. "I'll be in the field." He came in December, when the field work was finished and the shed was quiet. She walked him through the maintenance logs, the ledger structure, the rotation logic, and answered his questions with the attention she gave to any person asking genuine questions in good faith. He was a good listener, better than she had expected, because men trained to persuade were not always good listeners. The training worked against it. But he listened now the way he had started to look at her at Mercer's. Like someone who had concluded the information in front of him was more valuable than the position he arrived with. He spent 3 hours on the farm. On the way out, he stopped at the shed door and looked at the farmall for a long time. 28 years, he said. "Going on 29, she said, "and more economical than the new equipment. In this operation, at this scale, with no debt, significantly," she leaned against the shed doorframe. "But there's something your analysis never included, and I don't think you even knew to include it. The cost of dependence," he said. He'd been thinking about it, she could tell. Not just the interest, the cost of not understanding the machine. "Every time I fix this tractor myself, I'm not waiting for a service appointment, not paying dealer labor rates, not held hostage by a parts backorder. That value doesn't appear on any spreadsheet your bank produced, but I can tell you from 29 years of experience that it is substantial." She paused. "You came out here in July and told me this was a business and I needed to treat it like one. I want you to understand that I had been treating it like a business, a very precise and carefully managed business, long before you knew this farm existed." He looked at her for a moment. "You're right," he said simply. "I walked in with a conclusion and presented it as an analysis. I didn't know enough to know what I was missing." She nodded. He drove away at a sensible speed. She stood in the driveway and listened the gravel settle after his tires, and thought, for the first time in a while, about her father standing in Frontier County in 1936, watching his neighbor drive away. The sorrow was for the Hendersons, the Pratts, the dozens of operations across the county that had borrowed against promises the environment had not honored. The clarity was that the principle was simple and demonstrable and had now been demonstrated in the most concrete possible terms in the fields and auction blocks of one Nebraska county over 18 months. The principle was not complicated. It had never been. The difficulty was never in understanding it. The difficulty was in choosing it consistently, year after year, against the competing attractions of the new machine and the social approval of visible growth and the authority of the man in the good suit with the leather briefcase. She had been making that choice for 30 years. The spring of 1989 was wet, and in the wet spring Ruth's new neighbor to the west, a young man from Iowa named Garrett Colby, who had leased the Henderson ground from the Omaha Holding Company, stuck his leased John Deere 4255 in the northwest corner of his west field on a morning in mid-May. She heard it from her east field, the high whine of a large diesel working hard against a load that was not moving, a sound she knew the way she knew most sounds associated with equipment under stress. She finished her planting pass, turned at the headland, stopped the planter, and looked across the fence line. The 4255 was planted to its axle in the low corner of the Henderson ground. She had known that corner was low for 20 years, had watched water stand there every wet spring, had adjusted her own planting sequences accordingly. Colby was standing beside it with the expression of a man computing an expensive error. She walked to the fence. "Mr. Colby, do you want some help?" He was 26, built like someone who had grown up working, new enough to this specific ground that its character hadn't yet registered in his decisions. He looked at her, then at the farmall behind her, and she saw the calculation that a certain kind of young man makes without meaning to, assessing whether the offered help was actually help or was the kind of gesture requiring more management than it resolved. "I've got the dealer's number," he said. "Dealer's 45 minutes out," she said. "Call fee, travel time, and meanwhile you've got 300 acres to finish and the windows closing. Come look at what I'm thinking." He came. She showed him the problem. The automatic traction control was doing exactly what it was designed to do, cutting power at wheel spin, which was precisely wrong for this situation. You needed sustained torque to break the clay's grip, not interrupted torque. Override the system first. Then the angle of extraction, not straight back, because the clay's grip was strongest straight down, but offset 12 to 15 degrees to attack the grip at its weak axis. Peel it from the side rather than fight it head on. Chain from the front axle given the machine's specific tilt. Slow, steady pull, not a jerk. A jerk would snap the chain or drive the tractor deeper on the rebound. 35 minutes. The 4255 came out with the sucking, releasing sound of clay yielding reluctantly. Colby drove it to firm ground, cut the engine, and got out. He had the expression of someone in the middle of revising an assumption they hadn't known they were making. "How did you know about the angle?" he said. "Force is a vector," she said. "Its effectiveness depends on direction as much as magnitude. You had 140 horsepower aimed straight into the clay's maximum grip orientation. I applied 60 horsepower at an angle to its weak axis. Less force, better geometry." He looked at the farmall, then back at her. "That machine," he said carefully, "just pulled a 140 horsepower tractor out of a mud hole." 140 horsepower aimed wrong," she said, "accomplishes less than 60 aimed right." She went back to her field. He stood at the fence a moment, watching her go, and she did not look back. The planter dropped into its rhythm and the morning went on. By 1991, she was farming 140 acres, 80 original, 20 from Tennyson, 25 from Pratt. 15 bought in spring of 1990 from a family that had decided after 2 years of trying that a different life suited them better. She had paid in total $112,000 for all of it, in cash, over 3 years, from savings accumulated over 12 years of farming 80 acres without debt. The 140 acres were hers, completely without encumbrance. She started a new ledger. The old one was full. That summer, her daughter Patricia brought her 2 children to the farm, Danny, 15, and Loretta, 13. Ruth put them to work without apology, which was how she handled children, with the assumption that they were capable of more than they had been asked to do, and with the instruction required to make that true. Danny was quick and analytical, slightly impatient with process in the way of someone whose mind outpaced his tolerance for procedure. She paired him with the maintenance logs. Go through the planter log component by component. Assess each system against its maintenance schedule. Estimate the cost of required service over the next 12 months. Total the estimate. Then compare it to the monthly lease payment on a comparable new planter over the same period. He spent 2 afternoons on it. He came back with figures on a piece of paper and showed her, and the comparison was approximately 5 to 1 in favor of the maintained old equipment and he looked at the numbers with the expression of someone who has done arithmetic and arrived somewhere unexpected. "Why doesn't everyone do this calculation?" he asked. "Some do," she said. "The ones who do tend not to lose their farms, but most don't." She considered how to say the next part carefully, because it was the part that mattered most, and she wanted it to land right. Most people are better at calculating what they want than at calculating what they can afford. That gap between what you want and what you can honestly service is where most financial trouble comes from. Not just on farms, everywhere. The mechanism is identical whether you're talking about a tractor in Nebraska or a mortgage in New York or a country has deficit. Obligation exceeds capacity, sustained over time, and the resolution is never pleasant for the people inside it. Danny wrote this down in the margin of his notebook. She noticed this and said nothing about it. Loretta was different, slower to speak, more observational, accurate when she did. On her second day at the farm, she noticed one of the yearling steers moving oddly, favoring a front leg in a way that suggested something in the shoulder rather than the hoof. Ruth examined the animal that evening, found exactly what Loretta had spotted, and treated it before it progressed to something that would have cost real money and real suffering. "How did you know where to look?" Ruth asked her. "I just watched," Loretta said. "That's the whole answer," Ruth said. "Watching is the most underrated skill on a farm. Your equipment, your soil, your animals, they tell you what's happening if you're willing to stop and pay attention. Most problems announce themselves before they become crises. The question is whether you're listening." Loretta came back the following summer, and the summer after. She was the grandchild who called most often, and with genuine interest in what was actually happening. Not family news, but operational questions, rotation choices, market readings. At 17, she asked Ruth to explain the ledger structure from the beginning, and Ruth did. The columns, the categories, the logic. The difference between a cash expenditure and a debt obligation. Not as accounting, but as structural choice, as the fundamental decision that determines whether a bad year becomes a difficulty or a catastrophe. The concept of margin. Not the financial industry's version, but the farming version. The space between what you earn and what you spend, maintained not as a luxury, but as survival infrastructure. Every choice either widens the margin or narrows it. Debt narrows it. Maintained equipment widens it. Understanding your costs precisely widens it. Avoiding the payment your neighbor took on widens it, because you are not carrying his monthly obligation while he is. She showed Loretta the ledger from 1987, then 1988, then 1989. Let her trace the figures herself, the income line, the expense line, the gap between them that had been both the reason Ruth was solvent and the source of the capacity to buy when others were selling. "The arithmetic isn't complicated," Ruth said. "The hard part isn't understanding it. The hard part is choosing it consistently, year after year, when everything around you, the bank, your neighbor's new equipment, the man in the good suit telling you that you're going to be left behind, is telling you you're wrong. You have to have done the numbers carefully enough and honestly enough to know whether they're right or you are." Loretta looked at the ledger for a long time. "And if you've done the numbers," she said, "and you're right, then you hold the position," Ruth said. "Not stubbornness, not pride, because the arithmetic says so. And the arithmetic doesn't care about the briefcase." Dale Whitmore came back one more time. It was 1993, a spring Saturday, and he drove a Ford pickup now, older and muddier than the Le Sabre, a vehicle that had spent time on gravel roads and showed it. He was 41, and the specific gloss of his professional youth had worn to something rougher and more honest. He had left the bank in 1990 and was now with the County Agricultural Extension Office, doing financial counseling for farm operations. They sat on the porch in the same positions, him in the chair, her on the step, and the symmetry was not lost on either of them. "I wanted to say that you were right," he said. "In July of '87, the arithmetic you laid out was the correct arithmetic. I understood the bank's version of the analysis, which was not the same thing as the real analysis, and I didn't know the difference until the difference became unavoidable." She said nothing, because nothing was required. "I've been doing this counseling work for 3 years," he continued, "helping operations restructure or avoid restructuring. And the core of what I keep coming back to, what I tell everyone who sits across from me, is the same arithmetic you walked me through on this porch. The relationship between obligation and income, the cost of dependence, the margin as survival infrastructure rather than profit indicator." He paused. "I've told that to probably 200 farmers in 3 years. Most of them could have used it in 1987. Most of them were told something different in 1987, she said. Yes, he accepted this. The bank's product was structured for the bank's interests and presented as aligned with the farmers' interests. They were adjacent interests in some conditions and directly opposing interests in others, and we presented them as identical. And when the conditions changed, the adjacency disappeared. Yes, he looked out at the fields. The North was in beans this year, the East in corn, the West, the Pratt and Tennyson ground. In its 3rd year of the cover crop rotation, she'd been running to rebuild the structure that years of undermanagement had depleted. "How many acres now?" he asked. 140, she said. He did the arithmetic. She gave him time to finish it. "You doubled the operation," he said, "during the worst agricultural cycle in 40 years. "I bought when the price was honest," she said. The price was honest because other operations had borrowed beyond their capacity to service, and when the environment turned, the gap between obligation and income closed in the wrong direction. My gap closed in the other direction, because you'd structured for resilience rather than growth." "I'd structured for survival," she said. "Growth was a consequence, not a goal. I never set out to expand. I set out to owe nothing, and when opportunities appeared that I could meet with cash, I met them." He nodded slowly. "The principle isn't agricultural," he said, as if following a thread to its end. "It's not sector-specific. It's the operating logic of any enterprise functioning in an uncertain environment, which is all enterprises. Obligation in excess of capacity, sustained by optimistic assumptions about the future, resolves violently when the assumptions don't hold. The specific mechanism changes: farming, banking, housing, sovereign debt, but the arithmetic is identical." "My father put it differently," she said. He said, "Understand what you can control and protect it. Understand what you can't control and reduce your dependence on it. Debt is dependence on a favorable future. Cash is independence from the future. You can't eliminate dependence on the future entirely. You're farming. The weather and price are never controlled, but you can eliminate the kind of dependence that turns a difficult year into a catastrophic one." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. "That's the clearest formulation I've heard," he said. "May I use it?" "It was my father's," she said. "Use it." He drove away at the pace of a man who had learned to respect gravel roads. She sat on the step a while after he was gone, listening to the fields which were doing in late May what they always did. A low, sustained, unhurried industry, visible only as green deepening from day to day. She sold the farm to Loretta in 2005. Loretta was 27, had her master's in agricultural systems from Nebraska. She had told Ruth about the acceptance letter by phone, and Ruth had said good with the weight of someone who knows precisely what that means, and had spent 2 summers working the full operation under Ruth's direction, with the focused attention of someone preparing for a real responsibility. The sale price was below appraised value, structured as a contract for deed over 36 months, 0 interest. Loretta had argued against the below-market price with the earnestness of a young woman who had also been taught to be fair and didn't want to benefit from an unfairness even when it was offered to her. Ruth had listened to the argument, found it well-reasoned, and done as she intended. "The price I'm giving you," she said, "is the price that lets you start without debt. The market price requires a loan. A loan takes money from the farm and gives it to a bank. We don't do that. Loretta paid it off 4 months early." Ruth moved to Plattsmouth. Second-floor apartment, view of the Missouri, tomatoes on the balcony, tended with a thoroughness that amused her neighbors. She attended the county extension meetings when the subjects interested her, which was most of the time, and occasionally stood up and said something when it was warranted, which was enough of the time that people learned to pay attention when she rose. In the fall of 2009, Dale Whitmore, 63, and slowing but not stopped, asked Loretta if she would consider taking over a portion of his counseling load at the extension office. She said yes. The correct answer to a request to extend useful work into the next generation, Ruth had told her once, is yes. The sessions were informal. Loretta did not have a curriculum, exactly. She had a structure and the willingness to stay inside it until the person across from her understood it, rather than just heard it. She used the maintenance logs, Ruth's original notebooks, to talk about the economics of understood equipment versus dependent equipment. She used the ledger structure to talk about margin as survival infrastructure. She used the story of 1987 through 1991 not as moral lesson, but as case study. Here is the decision. Here is the arithmetic behind it. Here is what happened to the people who made the other decision. Here is the arithmetic behind that. She had a student one evening, a woman named Carol Siebert, 34 years old, second-generation farm family, who had come in with a proposal from her bank for a precision agriculture package. New planter, GPS guidance system, variable rate application software, totaling $280,000, at a rate that worked through the full 15-year term, would cost her $460,000 in total payments. Loretta put the proposal on the table between them and said, "Let's do the full cost analysis, not the bank's version, ours." They worked through it together for 90 minutes. Monthly payment against projected monthly income. Total interest cost against total efficiency gain. Maintenance cost of new computerized equipment, dealer dependent, software subscription dependent, against maintenance cost of known equipment maintained by someone who understood it. The cost of the gap between obligation and income in a down year, multiplied by the realistic probability of encountering a down year over a 15-year term, which was not low. At the end of 90 minutes, Carol Siebert looked at the figures and said, "The bank presented this as an investment. The bank presented it as an investment for you," Loretta said. "It is an investment for them regardless." Carol Siebert was quiet for a moment. "What would you do?" Loretta thought about Ruth on the porch step in 1987, looking at a man who had driven out from Plattsmouth to explain her own business to her. "I'd keep what I have, maintain it correctly, build the savings account, and buy when the price is honest. Which it will be at some point. It always is." She did not tell Carol Siebert what to do. She gave her the arithmetic and let her do it herself, which was the only teaching that held. Ruth Elaine Beaumont died in the spring of 2019, at 92, in the apartment in Plattsmouth. She had been reading and corresponding and attending the extension meetings until 6 weeks before the end, and her last entry in the household ledger, which she had maintained in the apartment with the same care she had given the farm ledger for 40 years, was in February, 2 weeks before the hospital. The month's income and expenditure, figures in their columns, the bottom line positive, as it had been every month she could account for since 1975. Dale Whitmore, 73 and now fully retired, spoke at her funeral in the small Methodist church in Plattsmouth on a gray April morning. He was direct and specific, which is the only honest way to speak about someone who was direct and specific. In July of 1987, he said, I drove to Ruth Beaumont's farm with a leather briefcase and a prepared presentation, and I told a woman with a graduate degree in agricultural economics and 12 years of successful solo farm management that she needed to treat her operation like a business. She looked at me and told me exactly what that statement implied about my assumptions, and she was entirely correct, and I did not understand it at the time. He paused. Everything I have been useful for in the 30 years since, every farm family I have helped avoid the mistake I was trying to sell in 1987, traces back to what Ruth showed me on that farm. The arithmetic she walked me through. The principle her father gave her and she carried forward. He stopped. She was right and I was wrong, and she was patient enough to let me figure that out. And that patience was an act of generosity I did not deserve and am still grateful for. Loretta sat in the front pew and listened. Beside her was Danny, who had become a soil scientist at the University of Nebraska, and who still had, in his office in Lincoln, the piece of paper from the sub 1991 on which he had written the comparison between maintaining old equipment and leasing new, with the note in the margin, most people are better at calculating what they want than what they can afford. He had used it in the introduction to his doctoral dissertation with attribution to his grandmother, because it was the most accurate formulation of the problem he had ever found. After the service, Loretta drove back to Sycamore Creek Road. It was late afternoon, the particular flat amber light of a Nebraska spring that makes the ground look as if it has always been there and always intends to be. She pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment. Then she went to the equipment shed and checked the oil on the farmall, which was 60 years old, and ran with the quiet reliability of something that had been understood completely and maintained accordingly for its entire existence. She checked the fuel. She opened the maintenance log. 8 notebooks now, Ruth's 7 and Loretta's first, in the cabinet beside the utility sink where they had always been, and noted the service date and the hours. She started the tractor. First pull. The engine turned over and settled into its chuff-chuff, the same rhythm it had kept since 1959, since Harold Beaumont drove it off the dealer's lot, since Ruth had learned every component of it and rebuilt it with her own hands, since Loretta herself had sat on its hood as a child watching her grandmother work the east field on a summer morning. She sat on it and let it run. The fields outside the shed door were coming into their May green, the beans just breaking the surface in the north field, the corn 3 inches high in the east. The Sycamore Creek ran low and clear along the property's southern edge. A meadowlark was working the fence line, the liquid notes of it rising and dispersing in the spring air with the easy authority of something that has been doing the same work in the same place for a very long time. She thought about the session with Carol Siebert, who had declined the bank's loan, built her savings account for 3 years, and bought a used planter at cash terms in 2012 with money she had, and whose operation was, as of last fall's numbers, in better shape than it had been at any point in the previous decade. She thought about the other students, the other sessions, the other versions of the same arithmetic, worked through on the same table, in the same extension office. She thought about how many of those conversations had started with someone who had been told, in one form or another, that their instinct to be careful was backwardness, that the new thing was the necessary thing, that the person in the good suit with the confident manner was the one who understood how the world worked. And she thought about what Ruth had told her at 17, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open between them, in the specific no-nonsense tone of someone handing over something they had worked out and tested over many years and found to be true. The hardest part isn't learning the right principle. The right principle is usually not complicated. The hardest part is continuing to act on it when everything around you is telling you you're wrong. The bank, the neighbor, the man who drove down your road to explain your own business to you. You have to have done the numbers honestly enough to know whether they're right or you are. If you have and you are, then you hold the position. Not stubbornness, not pride, because the arithmetic says so. And the arithmetic, Ruth had said, closing the ledger, does not care about the briefcase. The engine chuffed.